Notebook 17. The end of the 296th Infantry Regiment. From the 1st of July, 1917 to the 28th of January, 1918. Part 1. Last time, we left as Barthas talked about the repressive measures their superiors had placed in the aftermath of the significant soldier mutinies and protests that had taken place throughout the French army in mid-1917. One standout example was a new officer that was assigned at the Mort-Homme sector to organize the movement of all soldiers going on and returning from home leave. A commandant whom, with the way he treated the soldiers, Barthas suspected had been the director of an insane asylum or a camp of convicts back in civilian life. We shall see what happened after that. This officer, already on horseback at dawn, would scour all the roads in the sector from morning to night, falling on the columns of leave-takers like a thunderbolt, counting heads and trying to catch them in any misstep. Squad leaders had to watch out, for the slightest infraction of the rules would lead to them being broken in rank with no chance to appeal. Every day, this officer needed to claim at least one victim as proof of his vigilance, and it mattered little whether the soldier or non-com involved was a model of courage and bravery. There was no recourse. Their high command needed to make examples, needed to terrify them. Barthas wrote that on the day he was leaving for his fourth home leave, they were approaching Saint-Menehould when one of the poilus stopped to take a leak, then ran to catch up to them. But the terrible commandant surprised him before he could return to his place in the ranks. The situation was very serious. A quartermaster sergeant was leading them, and the commandant punished him with 8 days of probation. His home leave was to be suspended, and he would lose his rank. It mattered little that the unlucky sergeant tried to explain that he had authorized the man to stop and had done nothing more than exercise his rights as squad leader. In such arguments, the strongest one always wins, and the commandant stuck to the punishment he had handed out, calmly warning the sergeant not to risk making things worse by protesting further. The unpleasant commandant then accompanied the soldiers all the way to the barracks, making them keep formation and step out like new recruits on the drill field. But once the ranks were scattered, the anger started to surface. The commandant had returned to the office of the week's adjutant next to the village's police station. There he was besieged by the soldiers. Everyone called out to him, shouting that if the sergeant wasn't permitted to go on leave, none of them would go. Furious, the officer appeared at the window with a look that should have silenced them, but instead he was met by equally fierce expressions. The commandant was faced with such hostility that he judged it prudent to yield. "Let him go," he said. "This sergeant will serve his punishment afterwards." But, fortunately, when the sergeant returned from home leave, he wasn't bothered at all. Barthas wrote that throughout the companies, battalions and regiments, there were decent captains, commandants and colonels who were moved by these arbitrary punishments and emotions that invoked the most petty and ridiculous reasons. They made their voices heard through vigorous complaints which were, unfortunately, mostly useless. This unpleasant commandant, their so-called morale booster, had been imposed on them by high command, and he was simply carrying out the inflexible orders he had been given. Once high command decided the soldiers had been sufficiently disciplined and beaten down, they relieved them of this officer. He was named a lieutenant colonel somewhere else, and he had worked really hard to earn this promotion. Meanwhile, Barthas wrote that during his stay in that sector, he went twice on home leave. He noticed that, in the rear, the wild enthusiasm from the start of the war had given way to utter indifference. Each person had arranged his life with the goal of realizing the most well-being and profits. Whether at a cafe, a station, or any other place, if you approached a group of people, you would hear them talking about everything except the war. Everyone was so used to it that they had stopped caring about it. The price of wine had soared to great new heights, bringing enormous profit for those who could still till the vineyards. the war was no longer considered a scourge. From time to time, one would hear that the son of so-and-so, or the husband of what's-her-name, had been killed, blown to bits, burned to a crisp, smashed, suffocated, up there in the distant trenches. But Barthas wrote that these inevitable deaths were considered by these people as just the price to be paid in exchange for general prosperity as they waited for final victory. Besides the home leaves, Barthas wrote that no one from their group of soldiers ever left the trenches as part of battalions being sent to the rear for rest, because there were not enough soldiers left in the regiment to relieve them. For almost 6 months, the soldiers lived in the Argonne forest, cut off from the rest of the world. For Barthas, these 6 months of exile were interrupted by 2 stints of 10 days each, in which he went to Camp Soumia, near the village of Saint-Ménehould, for ballistics training. He wrote that his instruction consisted solely of sticking paper on the targets and bringing and setting them up on the firing range. He learned nothing more. Later, one November day, Barthas and his comrades were cutting an oak tree for firewood near their small fortress when Sergeant Gauthier came back from the field kitchens with surprising news. The 296th Regiment was being dissolved, and they would be dispersed amongst the units of a Breton regiment, which had just been decimated at the Bois-les-Champs, north of Verdun. The news got different welcomes throughout the regiment. For the soldiers who had been shuttling around between the outposts and miserable reserve dugouts for 6 months, hauling and placing barbed wire and other material by night, this dissolution was an unexpected godsend. It meant a getaway from the trenches for a few days. No one knew for how long, but they all hoped that it could be a nice rest before the winter arrived in full force. But for those who had comfortable assignments in the regiment, the orderly, the cook, the bicyclist, and all the way up to the payroll clerk and the quartermaster, the news brought uncertainty and fear of losing their cushy jobs. For Barthas, it was obvious that their high command had reasons for wanting to disband them. There was not only the role their 296th Regiment had played in the anti-militarist demonstrations back in June, but the regiment also had a bad reputation that went back to the years before the start of the war. In peacetime, the 296th Regiment had been headquartered at the city of Béziers, in the wine-growing region of Languedoc. In 1907, the region had been affected by an economic crisis that led to a catastrophic drop in the wine growers' prices. Massive demonstrations took place in the region, and in the city of Narbonne, troops killed 6 people. The killings had taken place under the government of Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, known as the Tiger for his brutality against his political rivals, and who became known throughout southern France as the Gunman of Narbonne and the Hangman of the Midi. During this period, the 17th Regiment, based in Béziers, mutinied under the leadership of a corporal called von Cave, and armed conflict was narrowly avoided. In the end, the mutineers of the 17th Regiment surrendered and were sent to southern Tunisia as punishment. The newly reformed regiments of Béziers became the 96th and 296th Regiments. In November 1917, the Tiger, Georges Clemenceau, returned to power as Prime Minister a few days before the 296th dissolution. Barthas suspected that perhaps the Prime Minister feared that there were former mutineers from the 17th still left among the ranks who could stir up trouble against his return. But if that was the case, Barthas believed he shouldn't have bothered. The 296th had now turned into a mix of people from all the regions of France. Few now came from the region of Béziers, and fewer still remembered the events of 1907. Nevertheless, the man von Cave, the corporal who had led the mutineers back in 1907, was still among the ranks. His past actions had not held him back from becoming a signal sergeant. On the 16th of November, the news of the 296th dissolution spread throughout the regiment like wildfire, and on the 19th, Barthas's group, with the last few remaining elements, left the Arrazé sector, where they had spent a peaceful 6 months and where they would have happily remained until the war's end. Barthas and his comrades went to rejoin their regiment at the Darniéville camp, of Florenton-Argonne, which consisted of barracks hidden in the middle of the woods. This turned into an over 20-kilometer march because the officer who was guiding them rode a bicycle and preferred riding along the main road rather than on the bumpy country lane, forcing them to make a very large detour. This detour cost the poilus 4 or 5 extra kilometers, but that mattered little to the officer. The first men to arrive at Dargneville had already occupied not only the best barracks, but the bad ones as well. There were 3 battalions in a camp that only had enough room for 1. For many of the men, including Barthas, it was impossible to find even a little bit of room, and so they were forced to spend a long, freezing night under the trees, though Barthas wrote that fortunately there was no rain nor snow, and they even managed to light a few campfires with brush and bits of wood to warm themselves a little. The next day, the soldiers were handed out flyers with the farewells of their division's general. It was written in emotional terms, recalling their exploits from Vermelles and Lorette all the way to the Argonne. There was a reference to the events of June, but the general declared himself highly satisfied with the regiment's loyal and proper attitude, saying that it had resisted being dragged into the defeatist campaign. Barthas wrote that the general could not ignore what had happened, but he was politically savvy enough to pretend to ignore it. In the evening, after eating dinner, the regiment assembled for departure. Barthas said that he had no regrets leaving the inhospitable camp where he'd shivered all night under an oak tree. Trucks were meant to pick them up, but Barthas wrote that, because on the way there was a large hillside that would have probably required a large expenditure of gasoline, the poilus were forced to walk for an hour to get to them. They arrived at the trucks next to the village of Saint-Ménehould, completely covered in sweat. And so they left on a joyless journey through unknown roads. The poilus, covered in sweat and exposed to the cold wind on the back of the trucks without any protection or comfort, shivered all the way. Around 3 in the afternoon, the truck stopped in the middle of the countryside. The soldiers got down, and then the battalion's leaders, through confidential written orders, started getting instructions for sending their units to various different locations. Barthas and the other soldiers wondered at why they were being so mysterious, taking so many precautions to hide their movements and prevent the regiment from being brought together again one last time for a big, sensational parade and review as was customary. For the poilus, this strengthened their suspicion that the regiment was considered to be in disgrace and was being punished. They were being treated like dangerous men, and it chilled their dignity. But still, Barthas wrote that the soldiers were utterly indifferent to anything that didn't have to do with home reliefs or peace, and so they didn't care about this. Barthas's battalion got orders to go to the village of Bassuet. They were herded like sheep there, and, as soon as they arrived, officers from various units of their New Breton regiment, the 248th Infantry Regiment, arrived flanked by aides and sergeant majors. They started making their choices, and in the blink of an eye, by sections, squads, and whole companies, the battalion was dispersed and disappeared. Only Barthas's group remained. Night fell, and a cold wind blew across the exposed and deserted roadway, and their group was still there. No one had wanted them, and they found themselves abandoned. Their sub-lieutenant, Loriot, was furious and sent out to the village to find the 248th Regiment's colonel and explain how 32 men from the 296th had been left alone and without anything to eat on the public highway. The colonel was willing to take them in for the time being. The next day, he assigned them to a machine gun company and asked the billeting officer to take care of their lodging. That evening, they had to go without food. Barthas wrote that they missed their field kitchen, with all its battle scars and wounds, as well as their chief chef, Mort-Homme, who had been awarded the Croix de Guerre for not leaving his station even under heavy enemy bombardment. As for their lodging, all the billets were already occupied, and so they had to sleep in an old coach house at the edge of the village that no one else had wanted. The roof and walls were filled with holes through which the wind blew, while the floor consisted of bits of straw that had rotten with the rain. Their small fortress at the Arrazés sector had been a palace compared to this, and though shells fell only rarely on Bossuet, the rain and snow that fell there during their stay would force them constantly to flee their little building and find a drier spot elsewhere. To the soldiers' great amazement, that very evening a tailor was sent to cut off the 296th Regiment badges off their uniforms and sew on the 248th badges in their place. Barthas wondered if for their high command the number 296 was truly so damning that they had to hastily cut it off like garbage. He wrote that if they had known how indifferent the soldiers were to it, they would have been in less of a rush. For Barthas, it didn't matter what regiment you were in, you were still under the yoke of militarism. And so, Barthas and his comrades were assigned provisionally to the 4th Battalion of the 248th Infantry Regiment, awaiting final determination from the higher levels of command. The 248th had been raised in Guingamp, in Brittany, back in August 1914. It had fought at the Marne, Verdun, and Champagne. Most recently it had fought at Bois-les-Chaumes, near Verdun, where it had suffered terrible losses. It had made camp in the village of Bossuet a little over a week before the arrival of Barthas and his comrades. The day after the Pelouse had arrived, the commandant of their new battalion decided that he wanted to make their acquaintance. As the soldiers were made to march out of the billet in single file, the commandant stared at them. Barthas felt that he looked at them like a butcher inspecting a flock of sheep. After they lined up, the commandant repeated his inspection, stopping at length in front of each man and posing questions to each about matters such as his conscription class and recruitment. Barthas wondered what reputation high command must have pinned on them, that the commandant looked at them like strange beasts. Then the commandant stopped in front of Barthas. "You're a skinny one, aren't you?" he said. Barthas decided to keep his mouth shut. "Why are you so skinny?" he asked. "Commandant," replied Barthas, "when you don't miss a hitch in the trenches for 36 months, you can hardly get fat." The commandant's voice softened. He turned to Lieutenant Loriot and said, "All your men look good, but you have this corporal who's worn out. Take care of him." Barthas was surprised. This certainly was not their former commandant Kanzkhan, who'd never shown any interest in whether the Poilus were too skinny or tired. Barthas wrote that these were the first kind-hearted words that a superior officer had said to him since he'd been at the front, and that was why he'd made a note about it. The days passed. Barthas wrote that one evening a troupe of real artists came to Bossuet to give a performance. Among this troupe there were female artists, and that was all that was needed to draw in hundreds of soldiers from all the neighboring villages. The brigadier general himself attended and sat at the front row. Barthas commented that it was only in the trenches that soldiers could get front row seats. Meanwhile, the 248th Regimental Band served as the orchestra for the show. The young, pretty girls were a huge hit. Half naked and decked out in jewels, they danced playfully, sang songs and performed suggestive, saucy skits. Transported and excited, the Poilus stamped, clapped, and roared with laughter. There were also some speeches and patriotic songs, but these were less well received. For Barthas, all this unconcerned laughter and joy were an insult to the hundreds of dead that the division had left behind in the sinister Bois-les-Chaumes. He wrote that the mud had not yet soaked up all their blood, and their comrades, who had seen them fall, were losing themselves like this, getting drunk on songs, music, and off-color jokes. Barthas didn't wait for the end of the performance to return to his broken-down house. A few comrades who shared his heartache did the same, and Barthas knew of some who had the dignity not to attend the show at all. After a week of staying in Basuit, the fate of Barthas's group was finally decided. The men were to be dispersed across various units throughout the division. Barthas himself was kept in the 248th Regiment. He was assigned to the 18th Company, in a battalion located in a village next to Basuit. He joined this unit on the 29th of November with 3 other comrades, including his friend Frézé, whom we've mentioned previously in other notebooks. The southern, Occitan Poilus were not excited about being incorporated into a Breton regiment. Frézé, usually so jovial, put his thoughts out loud. Did anyone think about that? About putting us with such grumpy, stubborn, buttoned-up, melancholy folks? I'll give them the slip pretty soon. Frézé was lucky enough to have a patch of chronic eczema on one leg, which had already gotten him evacuated 3 times. Now, as the group stopped to rest, he showed them how it was starting to soften, scab up, and form a sore. Soon it will be done just right to take up to the medical major, he said. Barthas wrote that in peacetime one would have felt sorry for someone afflicted with such a condition, but now they all envied Frézé for it. Convalescent hospital and a trip to home base brought the prospect of 2 to 3 months of rest. Once they reached their new battalion, Barthas had the bad luck of being the only one from his group, and the only one from the 296th Regiment, to be assigned to the 18th Company, and so was received by nothing but foreign faces. While other companies in the regiment had been almost completely wiped out, the 18th had suffered only minor losses, which had been made up for with replacements from the rear. Barthas wrote that the entire 296th Regiment was insufficient to rebuild the division from the disaster which had passed completely unnoticed in a banal communiqué that talked about reciprocal raids, clashes of patrols, and major artillery activity in the Bois les Chaumes. He wrote that a chimney fire would have gotten more notice in local news columns than that massacre which had covered Brittany in mourning. Meanwhile, Barthas presented himself at the 18th Company's office, where they gave him command of the 15th Squad, and off he went to find this phantom squad, which he didn't discover at any of the billets occupied by the company. During his search, Barthas found that the Breton soldiers immediately figured out that he was not one of them due to his accent. They looked at him with suspicion and were not interested in giving him any information. Still, he managed to learn that the company took meals in a building that had been converted into a mess hall. For Barthas, this was a surprising innovation and a true luxury. It was the first time since he'd been at the front since 1914 that he saw benches and tables being made available for the Poilus to use during their meals. Even if the furniture was rough and rudimentary, even if the ceiling had plenty of cobwebs and numerous drafts entered through holes in the walls, it still made for progress. It was at dinner time in that mess hall that he finally managed to find his squad. It consisted of a grand total of 2 Bretons who greeted him with unintelligible grunts. They were completely drunk, and apparently had been so for 3 days straight. They weren't the only ones. Barthas wrote that from the very first day he witnessed the passion of the Bretons for alcohol and wine, which led them to getting drunk whenever they had the chance. To him, it also seemed that a Breton would have thought he was dishonoring Brittany if he didn't have a pipe or piece of tobacco in his mouth. Additionally, Barthas discovered with disgust that almost all of the men were covered in ticks and lice. Still, he wrote that this wasn't entirely their fault. Clean clothes were distributed so rarely in the regiment that most soldiers possessed only what they were wearing. Barthas concluded saying that the Bretons were stubborn, quarrelsome, and unsociable only when their minds were clouded by alcohol. Outside of this state, he wrote that the Bretons were as soft as sheep, as brave as ancient Gauls, good-hearted and devoted. Meanwhile, Barthas discovered that the rest of the 15th Squad was either away on home leave or had been sent out in agricultural work teams. He wrote that the higher-ups were starting to understand that it was more useful to put the men to work in the fields than to aimlessly parade them around or make them play pointless games. Barthas also learned with great pleasure that among the company's leave-takers there was another southerner, the company's barber, who came from the town of Auch in the southwest of France. Barthas would have at least one person with whom he could bond, but while waiting for him, he spent several lonely days without a single comrade, surrounded by indifferent, if not hostile people who spoke in Breton, a language he did not understand. To make matters worse, their section chief was an old sub-lieutenant who lived by the rule book and followed it to the letter. He would visit their barracks 10 times a day with an endless stream of inspections, parades, and roll calls. It was a world of difference from Barthas's old superior, Sub-Lieutenant Lorille, who, outside of the duties in the trenches, never bothered the men with all the things he could have done to make their lives miserable. It was clear that this new section chief thought from day one that Barthas had to be brought into line. He hounded him and criticized him constantly, sometimes due to his shoes not being properly shined, or the billet not in order, or the squad not at full strength at roll call. One day he made a mocking comment and Barthas lost his patience. "Lieutenant," he said, "I'm asking you to speak to me in a more polite tone. You're my superior, but that doesn't excuse you. You don't have the right to speak to me rudely. Show me some respect if you want me to respect you." Before this, Barthas, reserved and solitary, had only spoken to the officer when forced to do so, and the officer seemed to have gotten the impression that he was a near idiot. The lieutenant was taken by complete surprise by Barthas's sudden comment. "But the chore that I assigned to you was badly done," he said in confusion. Barthas replied, "I've done my best. If you think you have to punish me, that's up to you and your conscience. Go ahead, punish me." Barthas wrote that he had to admit that the lieutenant didn't end up punishing him, and that, to tell the truth, he hardly ever punished anyone. He even showed himself to be indulgent and affectionate towards his men. Barthas heard that he had proven his courage and coolness under danger back in the trenches. The men in the section held him in high regard, and so tolerated his obsessions with the rule book without complaining too much. Barthas wrote that the lieutenant left him alone from that day on, and even showed him some kindness later down the line. During this time, their superiors sent the poilus out every day to carry out exercises, run races, and play games despite the snow that covered the ground and the biting cold. The poilus were not particularly amused by this. Meanwhile, the division was finally brought back to strength. Their superiors didn't want the soldiers to get soft by spending too much time in the rear, and so, on December 5th, they were sent to the front by truck. But we shall see what happened with this another day. For now, we've reached the end of this first part of the 17th notebook. With the dissolution of the 296th Regiment, to which Louis Barthas had belonged since November 1915, and his arrival at a new regiment where he's a foreigner, and with an uncertain future ahead of him. We'll see how things continue with this as 1917 comes to an end. For now, I hope you all have a good day, and I shall see you next time.